hello, Eric Garland. Nice to see you. It's been
Hello, Zeb Shalev. Well, it's been a long summer. I have a feeling it's going to be a long fall.
There is a lot of news. We have been very hard at work on a lot of things. Some of them are a bit of a retelling of history. Some of it are brand new. They're all interesting stuff. And that still starts September 8th will be the start of the season. This is not the start of the season. This was meant to just be an encore show. And we were going to discuss today Leonard Leo, who this week we found out got a $1.6 billion gift from Barry Said just to avoid some taxes, but also, not that Leonard Leo needs another $1.6 billion to spend on anything. So some taxes, $400 million in taxes. Apparently that's what happens if you're rich, You can get away with that.
He cashed out $1.6 billion in stock of Triplite that manufactures almost entirely out of China. That's just so interesting to me for, money from that enterprise to be funding our Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's not only the Supreme Court. This might be a variety of extreme right Christian nationalist viewpoints, not only the Supreme Court, because, Leo's others.
Catcher, school boards, these guys want it all. And with $1.6 billion in a year, tax-free or tax-deferred or tax-delayed or however you want to call it, you could probably get down to every dog catcher.
Yeah, $1.6 billion will buy a lot of elections. The thing is, isn't he Jewish? I think he's Jewish, and yet here he is. This was basically Christian nationalist positions that he's funding. I don't know about that, but it's just it seems unusual to me that anyone would give up $1.6 billion to just one fund. Never mind one as extreme as this, and it's not his first time playing in the sandpit with Leonard Leo. He also, along with the Koch brothers, was a key funder for the George Mason University renaming their legal library the Scalia Library, School of Law.
The whole School of Law.
Terrifying. He contributed to that too. These are unusual positions for anyone to be taking when I'm sure he's got other interests or family or other things he might want to give his money to. I mean, why $1.6 billion just to this Marble Foundation or whatever it is that Leonard Leo has decided to call his new effort? Seems suspect to me.
I kind of want to take a second and just celebrate this moment, actually, because we're getting down to guys like Barry Said, who some of the cognoscenti know about. The guys in the back room know about. A lot of the GOP candidates, I think Kevin McCarthy is pretty well acquainted with him. Mm-hmm. We're getting towards the real wiring of the Republican side of things, though. I think Barry Said does money in both parties. You have to be careful with these guys to say that they're just a funder of one, because they're frequently not.
I don't know if I might have read that he did fund both parties, but I think most of his recent activity has been to the right. But I can't be sure. I'll have to double check that.
That $1.6 billion, that's a chunk of change. I mean,
it's not only that Kevin McCarthy knows about him. Actually, there was a segment on TV last night. I couldn't believe it. I almost knocked myself off my chair. Chris Hayes on MSNBC did a segment about Leonard Leo, which is now a new thing. I'm going to actually think that should be the term. And Leonard Leo is the amount of time it takes for the mainstream media to actually get a concept or an idea or a name that originates first on the internet. It takes that long. So in this case, Leonard Leo is about a year. Thank you, Chris Hayes, for finally acknowledging that Leonard Leo existed and doing a segment about him. It's good that people get to know who Leonard Leo is, because this is the real money. This is when the money gets funded around and sloshed around all these radical ideas that bring you things like the end of abortion rights or women's rights or voting rights or gay rights or free speech or whatever it is that we're going to hear in the next few months. That is where all of this gets funded. And it's a lot of money, and no one really knows about where this money really comes from.
Well, especially once you have financiers who have offshore interests and who have businesses that are dependent on the decisions of foreign governments. At some point you start to look at, what's their duty to disclose under the National Security Division FARA unit. Mm-hmm. Just a thought.
And we're not just looking for people who have businesses in Russia anymore. Like you got to look at every single country in the world and say, well, wait a second. What are their real interests in playing here? And certainly China comes up a lot. And it's a bit of a hint of what we're going to be focusing on. It seems to me, and it seems to you, I know that there's China's efforts to destabilize democracy have been widespread and extensive, go back decades. And yes, they have been partnered with other countries like Russia. Certainly the Russia influence in 2016 is very valid still, but and all the way through to today. There's Saudi Arabia, there's the UAE, there's Israel. There's been a bunch of countries that have meddled in American democracy, but really none have been as consistent as the Chinese. And yet they seem to be, hidden behind all these other countries, let's just say that, and often behind a lot of these other billionaires. A lot of those billionaires have most of their financial interests in China. So it gets to look a little bit like, looks like a pattern, and when there's patterns, you and I like to dig into those.
What do the different countries that have decided they have a certain interest in America's politics, what do they bring to the table, if individually or jointly, right? Mm-hmm. Russia brings tradecraft. They're just, I said it in the first game theory thread, December 11th, 2016, they're great at covert shit. They rule.
They do really well.
They innovated this stuff, and they're the OGs.
And they integrate really well as well. Like they're able to immerse themselves in other societies very, very well. So, you're not suspicious about the Russian next door because they look so much like anybody else in your society. And yet it's often, sometimes at least, they can be doing all sorts of nefarious things.
Saudi can control the flow of petroleum and they have a lot of cash to spread around as well. Mm-hmm. So they bring that. Israel's kind of in the intelligence sense, they're kind of Russia light. There's a little kind of Russia heavy in some cases in terms of the composition of who's around. But, they have an enormous close knowledge of the United States. They know us better than we know ourselves. And a lot of them are binational. It's complicated.
And they have signals intelligence. I mean, they're very good at sort of eavesdropping. The Russians are good at integrating and showing up and actually pretending to do things. The Israelis are good at sort of listening in, manipulating, doing stuff with your social media, manipulation, sentiment analysis. That's what their coup de grace is. But, the reason they are so good at that is because they got a lot of their technology from the United States, firstly. Secondly, they're hedging bets. Israel's getting a lot of money out of China too. They know that they need the Chinese money too. So you got to look at it like China and Saudi Arabia and UAE as sort of being middlemen to these bigger countries like Russia and China and the United States, and they're sort of playing both sides.
Well, we had two choices in the early 90s with regards to China as Russia went through its transformation. And that was we either engage with them, economically, or we compete against them militarily and economically. And the choice that was made was the first one. And we, in doing so, we sent so much manufacturing over there and we had such a trade deficit and they just had so much cash from doing business with us that they've been able to front just about everybody else that wants to take a swing. And I think it's pretty clear that China, the experiment in trying to get along as, respectful peers, that's clearly done.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they're interested in being friends with the United States in the way that we're interested in being friends with them. They certainly are not interested in our human rights policies. They're not interested in allowing us access to their Pacific Rim. And they're certainly being more and more militarily aggressive by the day. So we should face facts. Those are real.
Yep. And, this is what Citizens United has invited. If you're somebody that wants to understand this, because we're a republic and a democratic republic, and it's incumbent upon us as citizens to be informed. And the way you do that is through public information. And the more that you shut down the source of money, then you shut down the people's ability to understand who's talking here. And America, my personal belief is the notion that money equals free speech in the United States is specious. It's been upheld as such with McCutcheon and Citizens United. But hopefully, the more we peel back just how much foreign money has flowed into the United States, it seems like that's a basis for lawsuits to try and, they superseded Roe v. Wade, which, by the way, flawed piece of legislation, did an important thing. Perhaps it can be superseded. Dobbs can be superseded. But I think Citizens United and McCutcheon, this notion that, money equals free speech. Well, whose money? Beijing's money? Mm-hmm. I don't see the usefulness in that. Much like I didn't see the usefulness, a bunch of, teenagers in Murmansk pretending to be angry American voters yelling at us on Facebook. That's like, they don't have the right to free speech here. And, you don't have the right to plug into, maybe, I don't know, Twitter's API or whatnot and go do whatever you want.
Hope not. Unless you work there. Apparently, if you work there, you get access to anything. So that's like,
I certainly hope none of them were serving foreign governments while doing so.
Well,
there was those two Saudi guys we caught, but
yeah, you know what? I think
you don't suppose there are any more.
I suppose there's quite a few. I suppose we're going to find out quite a few. There's a hearing on that coming up. So, it was a tough day here because, you sent me a piece from the New York Post about Steve Hoffenberg, who is a friend of the show, a friend of mine who was an enormous source of mine for all the reporting we did about Jeffrey Epstein. You and I sat with him on many hours of the show, listening to Steve recount so many incredible stories. Steve, or at least they think that it's Steve's body because his body was found quite decomposed, was found dead today at 77 at his home. Certainly the last time I spoke to him was about 6 months ago. He sounded, he always looked a little frail to me, and I was always worried about his health, but he was, still quite vibrant. And, it's sad. It's sad just for him to go because this was a man who has had a lot of critics along the way. People who've disputed his stories, told me that, he's not telling you the truth or he's making things up. And yet I've sat with him for probably more hours than anybody else. I think I sat with him for, endless hours over a period of time, maybe 100 hours, and listened to him tell the story over and over again in different ways. And I no reason to doubt anything he said. He was consistent. He was honest. Everything he said, I tended to, I looked around, we did the research, we found backup for it. There was nothing that he said that I couldn't prove otherwise. And of course, the biggest thing that he said that we could prove otherwise was that that Jeffrey Epstein was a spy for Israeli military intelligence. That is something that, I'm sure the Israelis, although we don't know for sure, but there are people who do not like that story out about him. There are people who have come after me for telling that story. And there's people who certainly try to damage Steve's credibility over the years. And, he's not with us anymore. So I'm going to spend some time tonight. And this will be interesting for both of us because, Eric, we've been around for longer than we realize. By the way, when you see this video.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
It feels like a long time. Can I just recount for the audience the first time when I was on the show? And for those of you who don't know, Zeb has a marvelous talent for not telling you what's about to come on and then having a video. A big deal. And I dial in and it's like, oh yeah, we've got Jeffrey Epstein's partner. And I was like, what? And all of a sudden, boom, talking with Steve Hoffenberg and like, oh yeah, Robert Maxwell's like, oh, it's so cool. He taught him the spy stuff. I didn't want to do the spy stuff. And it was like, well, here we go.
It's in fact, that's the episode. I was listening around to various tapes today because I really wanted to check in and see what shows we should play, what clips we should play. And there's some tremendous stuff that we're going to go through tonight. It's interesting because what he says is still so valid. He's so interesting, the story he shares. He's given us insight into Jeffrey Epstein's life that no one else was able to give us. And, he's gone now, but we do have his story on tape. And these are some of the tapes we've already broadcast live. Of course, I have others that have not been broadcast live, which are just so fascinating. I'm going to listen to them over the next few weeks, but I'm going to take us way back to one of the first times he was with us. He was telling us about Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell's relationship. And it's a fascinating 20 minutes or so. I hope you don't mind listening to it all because I think it will take us back. And it tells us exactly how he knew, he was the only one who knew that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein met in the 1980s. They didn't, in fact, meet when everyone else said they met, which was in the 1990s. They'd met previously in the 80s. And then Robert Maxwell.
When Epstein was sort of under the radar with, I think, Bear Stearns around that time, he kind of dropped off
and was working the Saudi arms deals in the 1980s. That's with Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell, he was working with Khashoggi at the time. And, Ari Ben Menashe was around that whole scene. Another person who's been on the show. And what he says here in this clip is so fascinating. And I want people to just listen to him again, posthumously. It's so good to listen to him. He's not lying about any of this. He's telling us that Robert Maxwell viewed Jeffrey Epstein as his heir apparent, that he viewed Jeffrey Epstein as his future son-in-law, and that he was going to pass the baton of the entire business, the intelligence business, the arms trafficking business, whatever it was that was at the core of Robert Maxwell's illicit life, that he was going to pass that on to Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein so they can continue their work in the United States. There are people who will tell you that is not true. There are people who will tell you that he was making it up and he had theories and whatever he does not know. I can guarantee you those things are true. They'll tell you that I'm not telling you the truth. But thanks to the magic of the internet and tape or digital tape, let's at least hear it from him again. This is how he describes the relationship between Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and what Robert Maxwell's intentions were. This is from 2020, I think.
And I'm going to skip over Hanson because I'm worried about the time. And I'm going to skip.
I mean, really young. Look at that.
Another day show. But,
that's a whole other show.
But let's get to the 1980s. And now Mossad has moved their operations from Paris to London. And Ghislaine Maxwell meets Jeffrey Epstein in London. And you know about that, don't you, Stephen?
Yes, I know about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and what took place in their takeover of Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell's spying business. That was a handoff from the father, Robert Maxwell, to his daughter, Ghislaine, who brought in her lover and boyfriend, Jeffrey Epstein, in the takeover of the father's espionage business.
You think like a hand-me-down, like a hereditary hand-me-down business? Like you would do at a restaurant or something?
Business records went to Jeffrey Epstein's Palm Beach house.
Was there a lot of money?
Complete takeover. Well, it was an important business, and it was on the game plan of Jeffrey Epstein. If you follow the dots from the Dalton School to where he went after the Dalton School to Bear Stearns, getting fired, thrown out, losing his licenses, being penalized, then going to work in the arms procurement business and the trafficking business, that was the master plan.
Do you think Robert Maxwell was in it too? I mean, do you think he had this was the thought about thing with Epstein?
He inherited Epstein. He took him into the business. He vouched for Epstein. He made Epstein acceptable in the intelligence industry. He sold Epstein's brand to the intelligence industry because that was going to be his son-in-law.
Right, so that was the driving factor.
Epstein's plan.
I have some questions about that because you have to train quite a bit before you are allowed to do interesting things. So I have some questions about his native talent there.
Well, let me elaborate on what I said earlier. Epstein left Bear Stearns and went to work for intelligence assets, men who were operators of intelligence for decades. That's Jeffrey Epstein's employment when he leaves Bear Stearns. And he spent years in training on Adnan Khashoggi, Douglas Leese, and a battery of others in the intelligence business. Years. And that's at a time frame, 91. Jeffrey Epstein starts in the early 80s in intelligence training. And in 91, Maxwell Robert dies. And Jeffrey Epstein takes over everything with Ghislaine Maxwell that was operating. So there was a lot of years of training.
So he wasn't a Wall Street financier. He was an arms dealer and an intelligence guy.
Amazing interview.
Well, it's what occurred if you connect the dots.
Yep.
And they all connect very well.
You know, I know bankers. I know financiers. And if you just told me those facts about any person, take the famous last name off, I go, that's a spy. And whether it's private or, double, triple agent, I mean, that's just a spy. That's not a finance guy. That guy can, finance guy will do your taxes, tell you, what, we're going to do exchange traded funds. But no, we're going to set up a series of compromising positions for these guys. I can get you missiles. No, that's a spy.
There's no question of that. That was the plan of Jeffrey Epstein. That's why he went for the spying road. I was recruited at the same time to go with Jeffrey Epstein into the spying with him by the same people. And I said, I can't do that. I mean, that's not my life, and I won't cross that line. And I'm not remorseful. I'm very remorseful of what happened in my career, but I couldn't go with Jeffrey Epstein into the spy. I refused that invitation, which came to me a number of times with the same people that hired Jeffrey Epstein. And Zev has been tracking this down effectively and has put all these dots on the table to be connected. Great job, Zev.
Thank you very much, Steve. A lot of help from you and from a lot of other people. So it's a fun puzzle to put together, I have to say. I wish it was under not such tragic circumstances, but I'm going to keep going with a couple here because I do want to get to towers and we're running a little short of time. So one of the things that happens is this software Promise comes along. Promise is this all-seeing software. It basically tracks databases from wherever they come from and can compile them all in one. So if you're wanting to find out what Eric Garland is all about, you can put it into Promise and it'll look it up your local taxes. It'll put, your last time you got a traffic ticket. It'll put whatever information it can grab for the banking system and everywhere else into one location. And then whoever's running the Promise software can get access to all of this. Now, this was originally designed by the Justice Department, although some people think it was actually the National Security, it would be the NSA that came up with it. It also got stolen by the Israelis, by Ari Ben Menashe and Rafi Eitan, the spy handler. And so they bought it, they put a backdoor in it and started selling it around the world so they could spy into the KGB or they could spy into the Syrians or into the Jordanians, spy agencies as well. Which is really a fascinating thing because basically we've all been big brothered to death for, 1984? It's a long time ago. The software was being around long before, we were hearing about PRISM and other things. However, what people don't really realize is that Promise was also brokered and sold by various people, including Adnan Khashoggi. And I say that with particular interest, and I'll pull this up the slide because I'm wondering if Epstein also had a role to play in addition to Maxwell. Maxwell for sure was brokering Promise, but I'm wondering if Epstein was also involved in this in any way. And Steve, I'm wondering if you have any information about that.
What were the years of Promise development and marketing?
So it was stolen, I guess, in 1983. And then Maxwell started marketing it in 1984 through his Berlitz companies around the world. And they were actually fronts for him to sell arms, but also to market the Promise software. And then as far as 1985, and I'm throwing this document up on the screen, you can't see it, Steve, but it's an actual Bill Weld, who I think was running for president until recently, writing to say that Adnan Khashoggi and his arms trading partner, they got to broker Promise into Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. So that seems to me...
Well, Epstein was in that circle at that time with those people.
Exactly those people.
He was working with them daily. So the answer is yes.
So, Steve, did you ever meet Rafi Eitan or hear that name, or did Jeffrey ever? Was he ever I'm going to go out to lunch with Rafi? You recognize that name at all?
I heard the name, but I wasn't in the loop in that component. Okay. I had my own responsibilities at that time, and I was extremely busy on my workload.
You know what's really interesting as well about Promise is that it was used for banking scams and financial crimes as well.
Yes, I've heard about Promise. There was no question.
So do you think Epstein used it at towers?
Epstein did the money laundering crimes involving towers that we've learned more about in the revolution of what's happening with Epstein's life since he was arrested in 2019. We've now gone very deep in investigating Epstein's life over the years you're covering, and we've uncovered that he was deeply involved in the Middle East and in the money laundering and the arms sales. And the Promise business is right there. And that's what he did at Towers Financial, the money laundering. So
it's possible that Promise was used there.
It's a dirty, disgusting business.
So promised that actual software that was stolen, that was designed to work at the Justice Department, may have actually been used at Towers Financial.
We couldn't pin down for you the actual points of fact. We could pin down what Epstein did at Towers Financial and how he was extraordinarily successful in what he did. It goes much deeper than what's been revealed so far.
In what way?
So it has not been revealed the magnitude of Epstein's sabotage of Towers Financial, deliberate sabotage of Towers Financial. And that's where it comes to play with Thomas Barak and Abraham Gospin and the other parts that you have some knowledge about, Zev. There was a plan to demolish Towers Financial for Epstein's enterprise enormous gain. And they were able to do that with Thomas Barak. Tom was the CEO of Colony Capital. He had entered into a contract to take over Towers Financial, and Epstein's group was able to stop that contract. And the Securities Exchange Commission has all the records.
I'm going to stop it there. I mean, because there's just too much to talk about without letting it keep going. Steve is a phenomenal guy. I had spent most of the time on the phone with him, but there were a couple of times when we met in person. One time on his birthday, must have been his 74th birthday. I bought him a piece of cake, and he'd done an interview with this documentarians I was working with, and we went out with his sidekick, who was an interesting guy who came from, he met in prison, and we shared a cake, he had a cake, and he wished him a happy birthday. You know, that was the person he spent his birthday with. He did not have any family with it. He's not have any real reason to do this for money in terms of passing it on to his family or anything like that. I felt like he was always noble in his intentions, and he was really honest with me in terms of what he knew. And I think with you too, Eric, I think there's no doubt that as he's telling us the stuff for the first time, you know, this was news. We were breaking it for the first time that Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein met each other in the 80s, and that there was an attempt to continue an espionage business passed down from Robert Maxwell, who was an Israeli spy for sure, down to Jeffrey Epstein, who Hoffenberg and others have confirmed to us with Israeli asset. So we've got there a continuity of knowledge then about the fact that the Israelis were involved with Maxwell, the Israelis were involved with Epstein, and whatever happened with Epstein in the United States was under their authority. And that's something we'll cover in the next clip I want to play for you. And it's something I think that the reason is that I get attacked all the time by people. Lincoln's Bible, who, by the way, is on that clip. You hear her asking a question or two. In fact, she seems to be deflecting the conversation into another direction there at the end there. Lincoln's Bible, whose real name is Stephanie Coffin. Everyone should know her as that name. She herself tried to derail Hoffenberg and me on several occasions. And on one occasion, she organized a attempt to kill an entire investigation by CNN. So we had contracted with CNN. Hoffenberg was going to do an interview with them. Aribe Menashe was going to do work with them. We were going to try and break the story globally on CNN. And she was the broker of that whole thing. And in fact, was a typical catch and kill, we have now known. And so when you hear Lincoln's Bible, a.k.a. Stephanie Koff and her cohorts, Greg Oliar and Alison Gill and even Glenn Kirshner, everyone else who's on that group of network programming that they have decided they want to isolate me or isolate others. This is who you're talking about. This is someone who tried to kill the truth about Jeffrey Epstein. This is someone who was working on behalf of interests aligned with Jeffrey Epstein to make sure that we did not know the truth about Jeffrey Epstein and all the terrible things that he did in the United States. So, a lot of you who watch this program sometimes dabble between what we do here and what they do over there. There's a real difference. They are propagandists. They are providing cover for intelligence assets, for intelligence agencies. We're doing real reporting, real journalism here. And because of that, they've come after us. Because of that, I see David Benjamin, another Israeli asset likely on the chats here. These people are here to destabilize America. They're not here for the truth. They're here to make sure that we are accepting their version of the truth because it covers up all the crimes. There's a litany of crimes committed by the Israeli intelligence agencies and other intelligence agencies in the United States that are being covered up. And it's these guys to have, I don't know why they've decided this, but they've decided that they should either perhaps they get paid, perhaps they're real operatives, or otherwise they just decided that this is something they want to do, is to destroy the people's careers who are telling the truth, and also disparage people like Steve Hoffenberg, who at the end of his life, who spent a lot of time in jail, having to deal with the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, 18 years in jail for the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein and his crimes.
He did 20 hard years there.
Yeah, this guy was apologetic and remorseful, and I know that to the core of him and me. I just know that that's the guy that I spoke to so many times. And so to have these people like Lincoln's Bible, Stephanie Koff, Greg O'Lear, Alison Gill, claim to be liberal-minded people who are supportive of democratic causes, to have them to try and destroy the stories of these people, to go on behalf of the Israeli intelligence agencies, and I apologize for getting a little bit upset about this, but it really is, it's beyond reproach, because I know a lot of people have time for them. You cannot have time for Lincoln's Bible. Who is she? Why wouldn't she even reveal her real name? Who is LB? I come on here with my real name. You come here with the real name. She can't come on with her real name. Her name is Stephanie Koff. Look her up. See who she is. And then you'll find out that there's a lot about her that's kind of mysterious, and a lot of stuff that's really interesting about her that doesn't add up. But most importantly, in my investigation and my research, it's clear that these people are attempting to hide the truth about what Jeffrey Epstein did in this country. And that's something that everyone should be aware of, because it's absolutely disgusting that they've been able to get away with this kind of cover-up, and that there is the media is, whatever, the media in the United States, of course, also controlled and owned by sort of dubious entities. But, the fact that no one is willing to actually look at these facts, look at the fact that they did a catch and kill on a Jeffrey Epstein expose that covered up we're talking about not only the human trafficking, we're talking about the assault of young women, the blackmail of politicians, high up politicians in America, the stealing of top secret information, confidential information, and stuff that you're seeing right now that Donald Trump is accused of. Guess what? Jeffrey Epstein did all of that too, when he got all that documentation from the people that he blackmailed with, because he had them, caught on tape sleeping with children. I mean, this is the kind of people that you are spending time, effort, and money listening to online. And certainly coming after me in the way that she has, but mostly after people like Steve. On several occasions, she really stood in the way of Steve getting his story out. And I can say that with absolute confidence. And it's disgusting. This is a man who wanted to get his story out, who wanted to tell the truth about Jeffrey Epstein. And Lincoln's Bible took it upon herself to stop this man and the truth about Jeffrey Epstein from coming out. It's inexcusable. And anyone who spends time listening to her, following her on her Twitter account, should be ashamed of themselves. And Greg O'Lear, who I used to consider a friend, and all these others, Alison Gill, how dare you associate with this person? Glenn Kirshner, how dare you associate with someone like Lincoln's Bible, who covered up for Jeffrey Epstein? That's who you're associating with. Think about what you'll go down at. We're associating with someone who's working on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein. Monster, an absolute monster. That's who you're working with, and that's who you've decided to put your chips in. And there's all of you. I mean, you know who your names are. I won't go through this list of people who've decided they can't come on narrative because Lincoln's Bible has told them that they can't come on narrative. You need to come on narrative and explain exactly why you've decided to do that. Because why have you decided that Lincoln's Bible is some sort of God and correct about this? Because you believe that Israeli intelligence, or are you being directed by an Israeli intelligence not to come on the show? That really is a question you have to ask yourself. I know exactly why and who you are. I've got all your names, and I want you all to come back into the show and start acting responsibly. It's absolutely despicable that you're associating.
Well, folks, we've been at this a few years, and Zev's not making up the taking the hits part.
Yeah.
And I certainly have.
Eric, you haven't.
Well, that's the espionage game. This is something, looking back through this content here.
Yeah,
that we did, and that first show that you just put on, that was pretty exhilarating. And it was like, and this is all you. I'm just, folks. I'm just color commentary here, but but seeing that timeline of like the 70s through the 90s, and you see all this Iran-Contra stuff, and all it's like, oh, yeah, and I have cognitive bias around espionage in the sense that I work in the intelligence field, and I'm looking at the spy stuff, because that's what moves a lot of the world is covert action. And that's why they spend so much money on it. And that's why they try and cover up what they're doing. And up to that point, Jeffrey Epstein's story, man, as soon as he kind of got exposed, I think they were expecting Clinton to win, right?
Yeah.
And then they were going to throw Epstein
Yeah.
who I think had started to pivot in the years before. They were going to throw Epstein at the Clintons, and then everything was going to fall apart. But then Trump came out, and there's spies all over the place. Then people started hearing about Jeffrey Epstein, and it's like, he's a pedophile. And this was really the beginning of the change in the story. And we did that here of, no, man, this is an espionage story. And, as far as other voices out there, not everybody can cover intel stuff proper, or nor do they want to. And I think there's a lot of stuff that gets covered as partisan, as Democrats versus Republicans, though the Republicans are a couch fire right now, there's no question. But, a lot of this is the secret histories behind it. And, that getting to work with Steve on that in the twilight of his years after doing hard time for these crimes, it was exhilarating to be able to work and, maybe not believe 100%. I mean, take with a grain of salt, because he hung out with Roger Stone a little bit, right? Didn't he?
He did. He was open and honest about that. Roger Stone also had an interest in the Jeffrey Epstein story and believed he could make some money off it. One of the first people I thought about today was, does Roger Stone know the news about him? Because I do think that they're sort of they came out of the same kind of era. They're sort of these larger than life espionage type guys. Maybe Steve wasn't a full espionage guy, but he was certainly a big deals guy, a big politics guy. These are the same kind of characters. They're very outlandish. They're the same age group. They certainly ran in the same circles. It was
some of the stuff that I maybe didn't buy as much, like, no, if Israeli connected spies or anything about them, you've probably heard the name Raphael Eitan, a very important figure in Israeli intelligence. And when the question got asked, hey, you ever have lunch with that dude? You ever meet him? Like, nah, I didn't hang out with those guys.
True, except he was not a spy. He never actually became a spy. Hoffenberg got in trouble because he was a business partner. He did a lot of the business stuff, but he was not actually a spy. And Rafi worked for the science and technology, the other branch, and the Epsteins and Ghislaine worked for the military intelligence people. I know there were two different kinds. One of them was in science and technology. One was military intelligence.
Today's a huge day for that. Actually, I believe. I think this is coming straight from the Biden administration. They're working on opening up these scientific journals and taking down the paywalls. Anything that's government. Now, we're going to talk about the Maxwell story. It's really important because. Do you remember what Maxwell got into in the United States and in Britain? And publishing what?
It was scientific documents and nuclear documents in particular. It was Pericles Press, I think it's called, or something like that.
They were looking, and then I think, didn't he have a chunk of Elsevier at some point? I forget, but
amazingly
cornering of scientific research as it came out, that was, that's classic spy stuff. And that was, okay, Epstein's hanging out with all these nerds. And this is the usefulness of having pretty, you got nerds and pretty girls that don't often go together, right? So you collect up the nerds and then you put them with pretty girls and then you get them, hey, well, how's that experiment going? Or what are you guys planning next to fund? Classic spy stuff. It's not about the girls. It's about the nanotechnology. It's about the nukes.
That's exactly what he did. That is so smart of you to go there, because one of the reasons we know that there's actually continuity between Epstein and Maxwell is because they did the same thing. He was involved in technology and making sure he got into Bill Gates's world and into Zuckerberg's world and Remever's world. Maxwell was into the same thing with scientists. It's the same deal. By pure chance, I Googled something here.
The guy did it all. And Steve took us through it. He's like, oh, no, an arms deal, Khashoggi. And again, that first show we're on, I'm just sitting there like, I'm pretty chill, right? But my noggin, I'm like, holy shnikes. Like, we're doing this like, and then he did the Saudi arms deal. And then, and it's like, this is great.
You'll love these. These are actually the FBI. Just did a quick search and found these on my computer here. These are the actual FBI documents that were following Maxwell around in those early days.
Maxwell's file.
Yeah, and it took British intelligence.
I've read it,
but assumes he may have during World War II. He's a brilliant linguist. Was born in Czechoslovakia. Immigrated to here. So these are the entire files as they're following him around and thinking, what is this guy doing in the United States with all these scientific documents, and meeting all these like chemical company
How did
people.
FBI counterintelligence, start tailing him? They're like, guy who has 6 names, guy who lives in a town that doesn't exist anymore, that maybe Slovakia, that maybe Ukraine now. Kind of knows the Queen of England, and he's running around with a bunch of scientific documents
I mean, it's obviously he's his spy. So you don't need to think very hard or very long about why this is the case. But, the fact that there is, as you mentioned earlier on, it's important to remember that, it's not personal, of course, that they're coming after me or you or Steve Hoffenberg. It is business on their part. They are trying to make sure that the truth about their enterprise is never revealed. And you know what? That's not good enough. We're going to reveal it. We're going to tell the stories as they come out. We're going to tell the truth when we discover it, because that's what journalists are meant to do, at least the way I was trained to be a journalist. And I'm going to play you another tape now, if you don't mind, because this is another show. This is when Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. We were both on together again, and Lincoln's Bible was with us. And I got to say, if he was in cahoots with the Epsteins and the Maxwells, he just sure didn't sound like he was upset about her being arrested. He sounded quite happy that day that she had been arrested. On the other side of this, I'm going to tell you the story about how I and Hoffenberg found out about Epstein's death. But we'll do that after we listen to some of this. This is the day Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. This is from Narrative. Take a look at this.
There's no doubt in my mind that none of us ever expected to see a day where Ghislaine Maxwell would be arrested for the crimes that she's been arrested for today. A very dramatic day. Let me take you through what happened. FBI agents arrested Maxwell at 8:30 this morning. She was living at her 156-acre property in Bradford, New Hampshire, which was bought in cash just last December through a carefully anonymized LLC. The indictment is 18 pages long and details how Maxwell enabled and participated in the sexual abuse of women as young as 14. And it alleges Maxwell lied under oath on 2 occasions. The indictment also describes a pattern of grooming, which sometimes resulted in sex acts in which Maxwell took part. We also found out today that Ghislaine Maxwell was not struggling for money. Between 2016 and 2020, she had 15 different bank accounts, valued at between hundreds of thousands of dollars to more than $20 million. Ghislaine is not likely to get bail. That's because she's deemed a flight risk. She has both a French and a British passport. But all eyes tonight are on Prince Andrew, the Queen's favorite son and the man at the crosshairs of this investigation. This is one of the most dramatic events that could possibly happen in a court case as big as this and in a case as big as this. Joined tonight by Steve Hoffenberg, a witness to many of the Epstein crimes, one of the few people who could attest to what happened during that time. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Hi, Zev. How are you doing on this remarkable Justice Day?
It is a remarkable Justice Day. Steve, you more than anybody else have been working so hard on this case. You know it so intimately. Did you ever think a day like this would have come?
I must compliment the FBI and the acting U.S. Attorney in New York City for the Southern District of New York for the amazing justice that occurred today and the shocking suffering that Ghislaine Maxwell is now under is probably one of the worst days of her life. And it's a sad moment for her and a great moment for the FBI, the victims of the crimes, and the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York.
It really is a great victory. When we think back to 2008, she was included in that non-prosecution agreement, which would have covered, I think, the years that these crimes took place. Do you have a sense of why they would not look into or not take into account the prosecution or the non-prosecution agreement that Epstein concluded with Acosta and the other legal minds back in 2008?
Ghislaine Maxwell, and I've spoken with her team regularly, and their position, her position to her staff and her spokesperson was that she's not going to have a problem. Mm. She expected no indictment, no arrest, and I can only see that the FBI is very serious about this case. The FBI has this case under control, and now you're going to see prosecutions because they have the main defendant under arrest other than Jeffrey Epstein right now.
And she's not going to get bail very easily. I mean, as we saw in that little piece, she's too much of a flight risk. She has no reason to be in the United States. She's got multiple passports, multiple nationalities, and international contacts. She's a real flight risk. So she's going to have to stay in jail in much the same way that Jeffrey Epstein had to stay.
Well, she faced filings in federal court today in New England explaining that she's not entitled to any bail in the arrest that took place this morning. The FBI, U.S. Attorney, explained step by step of her flight risk that prevents her to have bail, and it will be a very difficult decision for the court to override the FBI and U.S. Attorney and allow her freedom. It will be very hard. I'm just worried that her state of mind will create another suicide in this case, because she is emotionally suffering more than we can imagine, much more than anybody can think about.
It really must be. I mean, you can't imagine what it must be like to suddenly face, going into prison behind bars and being such a high-profile prisoner as well, and knowing what happened to Jeffrey Epstein and the fate he succumbed to. It must be very distressing. And yet, none of us could imagine this happening because she was so close to Prince Andrew. She still remains very close friends with Prince Andrew. It's believed that Prince Andrew was the reason Jeffrey Epstein got away with it in 2008. He was one of the forces that intervened on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein to get him that lighter sentence. And so everyone has sort of assumed the same thing would happen now. But clearly, this is 2020, and there's a very different team on the field thinking very differently about how to prosecute this.
Keep in mind that they fired the Attorney General, fired the man that was in charge of this case,
right,
Mr. Berman. And that happened recently. And now, 2 weeks after the firing of Mr. Berman, the head of this case, we see the most amazing part since Jeffrey Epstein's death occur by the FBI this morning.
Do you think
that's the arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell.
Do you think the timing had a lot to do with Jeffrey Berman's firing? Because it seems to me that it's quite, it's either very coincidental or it's followed quite quickly after his firing. Was it a message to Donald Trump? Was it a message to others that they were serious about this case and they were not going to be bullied by the firing of Jeffrey Berman?
It was a very loud message to the defendants in this case that have not been arrested so far. Now have Ghislaine Maxwell in federal custody. Now, Donald Trump, as the president of the United States, is at a different level of what he's probably dealing with daily because his plate is full. But the FBI understands this case now, and they are very aggressive in the prosecution in New York City of Ghislaine Maxwell, who's going to name names of very important people. Very important.
Why do you think she's going to do that?
Place.
Why do you think she's going to be naming names of important people?
The arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell, a very privileged socialite who grew up very rich and very comfortable and very accustomed to a great lifestyle, puts her behind bars in a terrible incarceration, in a terrible prison environment, in a very sad place. Now, if she starts cooperating quickly with the FBI and with the Justice Department, her imprisonment could be changed.
All right, let's leave it there. She never did reveal many names, not so far. And that's interesting. That is interesting that he said that at the very end there. Go ahead.
Look, any dude who does 18 years in the can and is psyched to hear about the FBI doing something is like, you believe in his sincerity, and you can hear in his voice that he was proximate to those acts. Maybe he carried some guilt around himself of not reporting them or something, but was just disgusted with that part of that operation, and you could hear he was glad that Ghislaine would be wearing Arby's napkins for clothing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I also think it's, you can hear in between the lines there of what I believe to be true, that he was helping those investigations along where he could. For that reason alone, would have been interested in their success because...
just so interesting hearing crooks tell you how to do it. Like, now, if she starts cooperating now, she's going to get some help. But if she's screwing around, like that, when that did get here, maybe that would have been 5 years. It's going to be 3, and if not, it's going to be 9. I mean,
he knew everything very intimately.
He knew the deal.
He knew everything about this case really, really well. I know that's where, I got a lot of good information from him. He was a fantastic source. And I did not for one second doubt his story. And I think no one should doubt his story. He's telling us the truth about a man who, and Ghislaine as well, it's a partnership that was determined to cause damage to America. This is not just a human trafficking thing. This was not just he liked young girls. This is not the case at all. This was people who were intent on harming the United States of America. And you mentioned that they were going to throw all of the stuff against Clinton if she had won. They were surprised by the stuff we discovered about Trump and Epstein, because that was a big part of what we were reporting on here about their connections. And so it's interesting that both candidates in this case was somehow connected to Jeffrey Epstein.
And he was hinting at this about who else is concerned about this case, because this is beyond, more than there's the abuse of the girls and the women. Then there is the creation of a sexual blackmail network that then goes and compromises people and gets decisions made that are not in the interest of the United States or of the fiduciary interest of the companies that are being run, or any number of things. And when you look at the systematic way those networks are created, run, managed, dismantled, covered up, and how many of them are, and how much damage they've caused this country, it's no wonder that you kind of need our show to get into it. It's not something MSNBC is going to tear into, but maybe because, well, who knows?
I don't know why they would, except for the MS part, because Bill Gates, you remember that MSNBC does actually is Microsoft, if I'm not mistaken. And it's
that's right. That's right. Gates was thinking about how do we improve your reputation here, Jeffrey? Now that you've been let out, which.
Bill
That's
Gates,
interesting.
What access did Jeffrey Epstein get to all our Microsoft accounts? Who knows what access he might have gotten during those years because of his friendship with Bill Gates and his senior executives over at Microsoft. We don't have much time, and I will tell a story that I've never told before. So the day that Jeffrey Epstein was found dead into the jail cell in Manhattan, it was early in the morning. I was up early. I started working on various investigations and just writing stuff, and this news flash showed up on the Twitter feed, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, well, that's impossible. We just started our investigation into Jeffrey Epstein just that a week or so ago. How could it be that he was found dead? And first person I thought to call was one of my first sources on this was Steve Hoffenberg. And I called him. I knew Steve was in hospital that morning. He had undergone an operation. But I thought I'm going to give him a call anyhow. I called Steve and I told him that Jeffrey Epstein had passed away, that he'd been killed. Maybe it was a suicide, but it certainly felt like he'd been taken out in prison. And his reaction was... firstly, devastated, because he said, this was my partner back then. This was my person I used to do things with. I know this guy for so many years. And then total fear. He was convinced they were coming after him next. I had various interactions with his doctor, who would not even let come near him at the time. He was so terrified that someone was going to not take him out at that point. And he had ideas about who that might be as well, which I won't go into now. But, it was a terrifying period of time. It was a complicated, difficult morning. I'd started the Jeffrey Epstein investigation naively. I didn't really expect it to lead us into all these kind of avenues. And yet here I was just, he was dead a few weeks into our investigation. And I was talking to one of his close business associates, and who was desperately in fear of his life at the time. We got through that piece there, but, I don't doubt Hoffenberg's authenticity. I never did. And people react the way they do, in those kind of pressurized situations, about as honestly as you can imagine that they will. And I think that was a very honest reaction. So he was fearful that every time he spoke out, his life was at risk. So, that is not something you choose to do lightly because you're wanting to make up stories or you're wanting to make money in the twilight of your life. It's something because you want to believe in, and you want to set right. I truly believe he wanted to set the record right on what happened, and to do some karmic, fix-up work after being in jail for 18 years for the crimes he committed with Epstein.
It's funny about the fear reaction. I've taken note when you talk about the different voices out there. I've taken note of who's ever not just been harassed, but who's ever been scared. Or looked at the timing of when they revealed a story that they knew was bigger than people wanted out there. And then something happens in their life. And, what gets characterized as paranoia by some, there are certain folks that know, correlation and causation may be close together on that one. And, Steve played the big game with big players. He remembers when, Maxwell's pension fund collapses and all of a sudden he falls off his own boat. Rough game. So no one is ever scared when they're being paid to lie for bad guys.
I grew to really be fond of him, and I think he allowed us a window into one of the biggest, if not the biggest criminal case in the last century. I think Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell need to be investigated much further. And I think we really have to understand what their whole operation was about. And Steve Hoffenberg was the one person, one of the very few people who had insight into that, who was willing to give us all a portal into that world, who was willing to tell us exactly what he saw, who was willing to, without doubt, explain what he knew. And you have to give the man credit. You have to say that regardless of his legacy, where he was, people are saying he's a swindler and whatever he did during his life, at the end of his life, it was all about telling the truth and about making sure that the victims got their share of the money. That was what he was interested in. At the end of the day, he was about the truth, and
what's a fella going to do for a living? I mean, I
gotta say, what a character!
He was a character. I mean, he's a leopard don't change his spots entirely. But I'll say, he launched, for me, several years of research with my own methodology and my own sources. And that story that he kicked us off with, I didn't find anything that didn't line up. Maybe it wasn't complete.
Let me say,
we didn't have time for that.
There is a direct line between what Hoffenberg told us and about what we later discovered Israel was doing. Maybe at the same time discovered that Israel was doing to support the Trump election in 2016. So there's a through line there that is not disconnected. We're still living through the reality of that history, and we're still living through the repercussions of that history. Without once get too deep into what I'm talking about, I think those who know will know. And I think, Eric, you've done incredible work on that front in terms of, why there have been elements of various countries and intelligence agencies supporting dictators and autocrats. Well, we learned a little bit about that through Hoffenberg's portal into Epstein's and Maxwell's world. So I'll be forever grateful to him, and I hope he rests in peace. He was a good fella. Eric, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. We'll do the show for real then. We have a big season ahead. I hope everyone joins us. It's our biggest yet. I apologize for losing it a little bit earlier. Maybe just, I get upset for Steve because I don't think he ever got fully credited for everything he did.
Well, we'll carry on his work.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us tonight. This was an impromptu show. It was just meant for us to say, hello, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with our brand new investigation. Please don't forget, we still need your funding for our next season, which starts in 2 weeks, at patreon.com/narrative. Please join and please support our network. It's the only way we get to do this independent research and investigations that we do here on Narrative.
Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.